You were never worthy of my son." Lady Winifred Vere did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The words slipped through the frozen churchyard like a knife sliding beneath silk. Quiet, precise, impossible to ignore. Every conversation died at once. Boots paused on gravel. Fans stilled in gloved hands. A dozen polite faces turned with the careful curiosity of people who wish to witness scandal without appearing to witness it. Rosamond Vere stood in the bitter December air with her two sons pressed close to her sides. 7-year-old Oliver gripped her gloved hand with the silent vigilance of a child who had learned far too early that adults sometimes smiled while doing terrible things. Little Frederick clung to her skirts, still young enough to believe the world was kind if his mother was near. Rosamond did not move. For 8 months she had practiced stillness. Stillness when the butcher demanded payment before cutting meat. Stillness when the landlord raised the rent without apology. Stillness when doors closed with gentle, polite finality. Stillness was armor. Lady Winifred stepped closer. Lavender perfume drifted through the frost. "You should have left the county months ago." She murmured softly enough that only the nearest listeners could hear. "But I wish to give you the opportunity to depart with what dignity you possess." Her pale eyes flicked toward the boys. "Now my patience is finished." Rosamond's fingers tightened around Oliver's. Across the churchyard, the vicar suddenly found his gloves fascinating. A pair of ladies turned their backs, whispering behind fans. No one interfered. Society rarely stopped cruelty when it wore good breeding. Lady Winifred leaned even closer. "When I am finished with you," she said calmly, "not a soul in Somerset will open a door to you." A faint smile curved her lips. "Not a schoolhouse. Not a shop. Not even a servant's entrance." The words settled over the frost-covered ground like falling ash. For a moment Rosamond felt nothing. Then slowly a memory rose unbidden. Arthur laughing across their small cottage table 2 summers ago. Arthur insisting his mother would soften with time. Arthur alive. He had been 29 when the fever took him. Young enough to believe he would always have time to settle his affairs. Young enough never to imagine leaving a widow with nothing but 2 children and a surname his family wished erased. Rosamond looked directly into Lady Winifred's eyes. "Good morning, Lady Winifred," she said quietly. Then she gathered Frederick into her arms, took Oliver's hand, and walked away across the frozen churchyard. She did not hurry. Hurrying would look like fear, and she refused to give that woman even that small victory. Only when the road curved out of sight did her hands begin to tremble. 3 days later, the letter arrived. Rosamond read it standing beside the narrow window of the single rented room above the harness maker's shop. Oliver practiced his letters at the small table. Frederick slept curled on the bed beside the stove. Outside, the winter sky hung gray over Somerset. Inside, the solicitor's words tightened like a noose. Lady Winifred Vere and Sir Morton Vere were petitioning the county court for guardianship of Rosamond's sons. The reason was written plainly. Mrs. Rosamond Vere, recently dismissed from her employment, lacked the financial means to provide proper care for her children. The Vere family therefore sought custody to ensure the boys' appropriate upbringing. Rosamond read the letter twice, then a third time. Her hands remained perfectly steady. In England, a widow could lose her children if she could not provide sufficiently, if powerful relatives argued the case convincingly, if a judge believed wealth offered a better future than love. Lady Winifred had chosen her weapon carefully. Rosamond folded the letter. She sat at the small table and made a list. Possible employment, possible help, possible escape. The list was short. At the bottom she wrote 2 words. Westhaven Park. The estate of the Duke of Westhaven, Ardan Lennox. A man whispered about throughout Somerset with equal parts admiration and unease. Cold, brilliant, dangerously indifferent to the opinion of society. 2 weeks ago she had heard the Duke was searching for a governess. She had dismissed the idea then. Approaching the gates of Westhaven felt too close to begging. Now pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. That night she wrote a letter. The next morning Oliver carried it to the post. And 3 days later, a winter storm swallowed the Somerset roads. Rosamond had not meant to walk past Westhaven Park. The errand had been simple, collecting mending from the vicar's wife. But the snow began suddenly. Thick white sheets driven sideways by the wind. Within minutes the road vanished. Cold soaked through her boots. Her left foot went numb. By the time the wrought iron gates of Westhaven emerged from the storm, she was shaking violently. The gatehouse windows glowed with warm lamplight. Rosamond stood before the iron bars, staring. Pride argued one last time with survival. Then her leg buckled. The world tilted. Snow rushed up to meet her. She landed hard against the frozen ground. For a moment she simply sat there, breath shallow, mind clear. Oliver and Frederick are waiting. She tried to stand. Her body refused. Then the gate opened. Iron hinges groaned against the wind. Boots crunched through the snow. A tall figure emerged from the storm. He crouched before her, coat dusted white, eyes sharp beneath the gray sky. "Mrs. Vere," the man said calmly. Rosamond blinked up at him in confusion. "You know me? I received your letter this morning." The Duke of Westhaven studied her with cool, assessing eyes. Then he extended his hand. "Can you stand?" Rosamond looked at the Duke's outstretched hand. For one fragile second, pride tried to rise again. 8 months of fighting quietly for dignity did not surrender easily, but the snow was already melting through her boots. Her fingers had begun to stiffen, and somewhere 2 small boys were waiting in a cold room above a harness-maker's shop. She placed her hand in his. The Duke lifted her easily, one arm steady beneath her shoulder. There was nothing theatrical in the movement, no murmured comfort, no polite embarrassment, only strength and certainty. When she swayed slightly, he did not comment. His hand remained lightly at her elbow as though this had always been its natural place. "You're frozen," he said simply. "I will recover. I do not doubt it." The answer carried the faintest hint of something unexpected. Approval, perhaps. Snow whipped around them as he turned toward the gates. "Come inside." "I must return to the village," she said quickly. "My sons are alone." "They will not remain so." He spoke without looking back. "I will send a carriage." Rosamond hesitated. He stopped and faced her again. "Mrs. Vere," he said quietly, "you will not reach the village in this storm." The gray eyes studied her, calm and unyielding. "Allow me to solve the problem before it becomes fatal." There was no arrogance in the statement, only fact. Rosamond exhaled slowly. "Very well." Westhaven Park rose from the storm like something carved out of permanence itself. High stone walls, tall chimneys breathing steady columns of smoke, windows glowing with the deep warmth of a house that had never known hunger. Rosamond had seen grand houses before. Arthur's family estate had been impressive. But Westhaven was something else entirely. Power made visible in stone. Inside, warmth wrapped around her instantly. A vast entrance hall stretched upward beneath vaulted ceilings where chandeliers hung like constellations. Portraits of long-dead nobles watched from the walls. She became painfully aware of her appearance. Snow clung to her shawl. Her coat sleeves showed careful mending. Her boots dripped melting slush across the polished floor. "Mrs. Burrell." The Duke's voice carried quietly through the hall. A woman appeared almost immediately. She was in her 50s, perhaps, broad-shouldered, with intelligent eyes and the composed expression of someone who had governed a large household for many years. Her gaze swept over Rosamond once. Not unkind, simply thorough. "Fire and dry things," she said briskly. "The blue sitting room." "Her sons are alone in the village," the Duke added. "Pewit will fetch them." Mrs. Burrell inclined her head. "Of course." She turned to Rosamond. "This way, if you please." The blue sitting room was warm enough to make Rosamond dizzy. Real warmth. Not the thin heat of a small stove, but the deep, steady warmth of wealth. A fire burned brightly in the hearth. Heavy curtains kept the storm outside. Within minutes, Mrs. Burrell had produced dry stockings, a thick shawl, and a cup of tea strong enough to bring life back into frozen hands. Rosamond sat near the fire. For the first time in weeks, she stopped calculating. Bread, rent, coal. Every day of the past 8 months had been a quiet arithmetic of survival. But here, for one moment, the calculations paused. The Duke entered 20 minutes later. He had changed his coat. His hair, still slightly damp from the snow, caught the firelight as he crossed the room and sat opposite her. "You applied for the governess position," he said. "Yes." "Your letter was direct. I believed honesty would be useful." It was. His gaze remained steady on her. "You were dismissed from the village school." Rosamond held his eyes. "At the instigation of Lady Winifred Vere." The Duke nodded slightly, as I suspected. "And yet," he continued, "you still applied here." "I am qualified." A faint flicker touched his expression, not amusement, something quieter, approval again. "My sons are 7 and 5, he said. "Their mother died 6 years ago." Rosamond felt something soften in her chest. "They are not badly behaved children," he continued. "They are lonely children." She nodded slowly. "I understand that very well." For a long moment he simply looked at her, not politely, not casually, but with the same focused attention she had noticed at the gate. "You have children of your own," he said. 2 boys. They would require accommodation." "Yes, that can be arranged." Rosamond blinked. "Most governess positions forbade such complications entirely. You would allow them to live here?" "I have 50 rooms." His voice remained calm. 2 children will not inconvenience the estate." The matter apparently was settled. Just like that. She stared at him across the fire. The storm rattled softly against the windows. "Why?" she asked quietly. The Duke rose and walked toward the window, looking out at the falling snow. Then he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Because," he said evenly, "some doors should remain open." At that moment the carriage arrived from the village, and 2 small boys were being brought through the gates of Westhaven Park. The carriage arrived just after nightfall. Rosamond heard it before she saw it. The crunch of wheels over the snow-covered drive, the distant murmur of voices in the entrance hall. She rose from the chair before the footman even knocked. When the door opened, Oliver stepped inside first. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a boy who had decided it was his responsibility to protect his younger brother. Frederick followed, clutching Oliver's sleeve with mittened fingers. The moment he saw her, he ran. "Mama!" Rosamond knelt as he collided with her, burying his cold face against her shoulder. "I knew you'd come back," he said into her shawl. Oliver stood a few feet away, trying very hard to look composed, but his eyes betrayed him. Rosamond opened one arm toward him. He crossed the room quickly. For a moment, the 3 of them simply held each other beside the fire. Across the room, the Duke watched quietly. He said nothing, but something in the rigid line of his shoulders softened. The following morning, Rosamond met the Duke's sons. The library at Westhaven Park was larger than the entire village schoolhouse. Shelves climbed 2 stories toward a painted ceiling. Tall windows looked out across frost-covered gardens. And seated at a table beneath the window was a dark-haired boy with a book open before him. He glanced up as she entered. Oliver Lennox, 7 years old. Sharp gray eyes that mirrored his father's almost exactly. "You're the new governess," he said. His tone carried the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who had grown accustomed to adults arriving and disappearing again. "Yes, the last one left," I heard. Rosamond walked forward and pulled out the chair opposite him, sitting so they were eye level. "What happened?" she asked. Oliver shrugged lightly. "She said Frederick was impossible." "Is he?" "Sometimes." The honesty of the answer almost made Rosamond smile. "And you?" she asked. "What would make the position suitable?" Oliver considered that with surprising seriousness. Then he closed the book slowly. "Someone who stays." The words landed quietly in the large room. Rosamond held his gaze. "I intend to stay." Oliver studied her for a long moment. Children had a way of recognizing truth long before adults did. Finally, he nodded once. "Good," he said. "Frederick is probably getting into something in the East Corridor." Within a week, the 4 boys had formed their own quiet alliance. Oliver and Oliver circled each other cautiously at first. 2 thoughtful boys measuring the strength of a possible friendship. Frederick and little Freddie required no such negotiations. They simply decided they liked each other and immediately began speaking in a language composed mostly of enthusiastic noises and questionable ideas. The halls of Westhaven Park filled with laughter, something that had apparently been absent for a long time. Rosamond noticed the Duke sometimes paused in the doorway of the schoolroom. He never interrupted. He simply watched, as though committing the sight to memory. One afternoon she found him there again, leaning against the doorframe, gray eyes observing the chaos of 4 boys building an elaborate fortress from library cushions. "You were correct," he said quietly. "About loneliness." Rosamond looked at him. "They are happier." "Yes." He watched them for another moment. "They have stopped waking in the night." Something in his voice shifted then, a subtle crack in the armor he wore so carefully. "For 3 years," he added softly. "They did not sleep well." Rosamond felt the weight of that admission, the quiet exhaustion behind it. "You stayed," he said after a moment. It was not quite a question, but not entirely a statement either. She met his gaze steadily. "I told Oliver I would." Something moved across his face, a brief expression she couldn't fully name. Relief, perhaps, or something deeper. He inclined his head once. "Good." Then he turned and walked down the corridor. But Rosamond noticed something that none of the children did. For the first time since she had arrived at Westhaven Park, the Duke of Westhaven was smiling, and she had the strange, unsettling feeling that something far more dangerous than employment had just begun. 2 weeks after Rosamond's arrival at Westhaven Park, she discovered the portrait. The upper gallery was rarely used. A long, quiet corridor lined with tall windows and older paintings, ancestors who stared down with the patient indifference of people who had ruled Somerset for centuries. Rosamond had come looking for a missing atlas. Instead, she found a canvas turned deliberately toward the wall. It stood alone between 2 landscapes. Something about the careful way it had been placed caught her attention. She hesitated, then gently turned it. A young woman looked back at her, fair-haired, perhaps 25. Her expression was warm in a way portraits rarely managed to capture, open, kind, unmistakably alive. She sat in a garden chair holding a dark-haired toddler. Oliver Lennox, even as a child, his serious eyes were recognizable. Rosamond stood very still. The Duke's wife, Clara Lennox, dead 6 years. The housekeeper had mentioned her only once. Quietly, as if speaking of something fragile, footsteps sounded behind her. You found her. Rosamond turned. Oliver Lennox stood at the end of the corridor. He approached slowly, hands behind his back. We keep it turned around, he explained. Father doesn't like people staring at her. Rosamond studied the portrait again. She looks kind. She was. Oliver's voice carried the absolute certainty of a child's memory. Frederick doesn't remember her, he added. So I tell him stories. Rosamond crouched beside him. That's a good thing to do. He nodded, satisfied, then looked at her carefully. Are you glad you came here? The question startled her. Children often ask the most dangerous questions without realizing it. Rosamond considered the answer honestly. Yes, she said finally. Very glad. Oliver studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded once as though confirming a private theory. Good. And walked away. Rosamond replaced the portrait exactly as she had found it, face toward the wall. Later that same week, something unexpected happened. Rosamond nearly collided with the Duke in the entrance hall. She was carrying a stack of history books for Oliver's lessons when he turned the corner. The book slipped. His hand caught her elbow instantly. The other hand steadied the falling stack before it hit the floor. For a brief moment they stood very close, closer than either had intended. Rosamond became aware of the faint scent of cedar from his coat, the warmth of his hand through the sleeve of her dress, the precise, unwavering focus of his attention. She stepped back quickly. My apologies. No harm done. He glanced at the books. History? Oliver is ready for it. He nodded. You will find more in the lower shelves of the library. Then something else caught her eye. A door down the east corridor stood open. Inside was a room she had never seen before. Rosamond stepped slightly to look. Maps lined the walls. Shelves of books filled one side. A large globe stood near the window. And at the center, a long school table with benches. A proper classroom, far larger than the small nursery room she had been using. She turned slowly toward him. When did this appear? He paused. The week you arrived. You built an entire schoolroom in a week? I had it prepared. His tone remained calm, almost dismissive. As a precaution. A precaution for what? He looked at the maps rather than at her. Your letter mentioned teaching 30 pupils at the village school. She blinked. This room could hold them. If you wish to teach village children here, he said lightly, the estate could accommodate it. Rosamond looked around the room again. The maps, the carefully arranged desks, the globe. Someone had designed this space with attention, with thought, with remarkable speed, and suddenly she understood. You expected me to stay, she said quietly. For the first time since she had known him. The Duke hesitated, only for a second. Then he said simply, I hoped. The word hung between them. Rosamond felt something shift deep in her chest. Something warm, something dangerous, because hope was not something a man like Arden Lennox offered lightly. And if he was hoping, then this was no longer simply employment. By the third week, the entire house had begun to change. The difference was subtle at first. Servants lingered longer in the corridors when the boys were laughing. The schoolroom windows stayed open to the winter sun. Even Mrs. Burrell, who governed West Haven with formidable calm, occasionally paused outside the classroom door just to listen. 4 boys now ran through the halls where once there had only been quiet. But the change Rosamond noticed most was the Duke. Arden Lennox had always been present in the house the way mountains were present in a landscape. Solid, distant, impossible to ignore. Yet lately he appeared more often. In the schoolroom doorway, near the gardens, in the library at odd hours. Always observing, never interrupting, but always there. One afternoon, Rosamond found him standing by the window while the boys argued loudly about the proper route of the River Severn on a map. You encourage debate, he said. It teaches them to think. They seem to enjoy it. They enjoy being heard. Lennox watched them for another moment, then said quietly, You have altered this house more quickly than I expected. Rosamond folded the map carefully. Children alter houses, she said. They only require permission. His gaze moved to her, and something passed between them that felt unexpectedly intimate. Before either could say more, a voice interrupted from the doorway. Well now. A man stepped inside the room with the relaxed confidence of someone entirely comfortable everywhere he went. Tall, handsome, broad-shouldered. Lord Aubrey Crane, a guest of the Duke's for a 4-day shooting party. Rosamond had heard the name that morning at breakfast. But hearing and seeing were very different things. Crane's eyes settled on her immediately. His smile widened. "And this," he said pleasantly, "must be the remarkable Mrs. Vere I've heard about." Rosamond inclined her head politely. "Lord Aubrey." The boys continued their argument loudly in the background. Crane glanced between them with amusement. "4 boys in one room and no furniture destroyed," he observed. "You truly are remarkable." Rosamond smiled faintly. Only moderately so. But Lord Aubrey had already decided something. That much was obvious. Over the next several days he appeared wherever she happened to be. In the gardens, in the library, even once in the schoolroom under the pretense of observing geography lessons. He was charming, attentive, the kind of man who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. And Rosamond noticed something else. Every time Lord Aubrey approached, the Duke appeared somewhere nearby, sometimes only for a moment, sometimes long enough to exchange a few quiet words, but always present, watching. On the 3rd afternoon, Crane walked beside Rosamond along the winter garden wall. "I must confess something," he said lightly. "I did not expect to find the most interesting person in Somerset working as a governess." Rosamond looked at him calmly. "I assure you the village school once held 30 equally interesting people." He laughed warmly. "You see, exactly what I mean." Then his tone softened. "You deserve a far easier life than this, Mrs. Vere." She felt the weight of the words, because he was not entirely wrong. A widowed woman in her position rarely received such offers of attention, security, comfort, possibility. Crane stopped walking. "I intend to call on you when next I return to the county," he said. Rosamond hesitated. The answer that courtesy required hovered on her tongue. But before she could speak, she felt it. That strange sensation she had begun noticing lately. The unmistakable awareness of someone watching. She turned slightly. Across the garden near the study window, the Duke stood perfectly still, not interrupting, not approaching, simply observing. Gray eyes fixed entirely on her, the moment stretched. Rosamond turned back to Lord Aubrey. "I would be happy to receive visitors," she said politely. Crane smiled, but something in her voice had changed. And across the garden, the Duke's expression had gone completely unreadable. The change began the very next morning. At first, Rosamond told herself she was imagining it, but by the 2nd day she could no longer pretend. The Duke had withdrawn, not visibly, not rudely. Arden Lennox was far too controlled a man for obvious displays. At breakfast he spoke with his usual calm politeness. At dinner he asked after the boys' lessons. In the corridors he inclined his head when they passed. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The precise attention he had once given her, the quiet gravity of it, the unmistakable sense that when he looked at her the rest of the room disappeared, was gone. Now his gaze moved past her with careful neutrality, as though he had deliberately placed distance where warmth had begun to grow. Rosamond continued her work. Lessons, meals, 4 energetic boys who required constant supervision. From the outside, the household remained exactly the same, but inside her chest, something tightened each time she felt that absence. On the 4th evening, she passed the study door while returning a book to the library. Inside, she heard voices. Lord Aubrey's first, warm, easy. "You must admit she is remarkable, Lennox." Silence followed. Then the Duke's voice, low, controlled. "Mrs. Vere is under my employment." "Yes, of course, but she is also a widow, a woman free to consider her future." Another pause. "I would not interfere improperly," Aubrey continued smoothly. "But a suitable marriage might benefit her greatly." Rosamond's breath caught. The Duke spoke again, and this time his voice carried something harder beneath the calm. "Mrs. Vere," he said slowly, "is also under my protection." The words landed like iron. Aubrey laughed lightly. "I assure you I mean nothing improper." "And yet," Lennox replied quietly. "You continue the discussion." The silence that followed stretched long and tense. Finally, Aubrey sighed. "Very well, I see your position." Rosamond stepped away from the door before either man could emerge. Her heart was beating far too fast. "Under my protection." The words echoed through her thoughts long after she reached her room. 2 days later, Mrs. Burrell stopped her in the corridor. The housekeeper rarely spoke unnecessarily, which meant when she did, the matter was serious. "He has not eaten properly in 5 days," she said without preamble. Rosamond blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "His Grace." Mrs. Burrell folded her arms. "Soup returned untouched. Dinner half finished. 3 mornings in the stables before dawn." She studied Rosamond carefully. "I have run this household for 22 years. Rosamond said nothing. "I was here when the first Duchess died," Mrs. Burrell continued quietly. "I know what this house looks like when he closes himself off." The words hung heavily in the corridor. Then the housekeeper added, and I know what it looked like before you arrived. Rosamond felt her pulse quicken. Mrs. Burrell adjusted the linen stack in her arms. That is all. And walked away. Rosamond stood in the corridor for several long minutes. Then she turned and walked directly to the Duke's study. The door stood half open. Inside, Lennox sat at his desk beneath the lamplight, reading estate papers. He looked up as she entered. Surprise flickered briefly across his face. Mrs. Ver, I did not invite Lord Aubrey. The words came out more quickly than she intended. Silence filled the room. She stepped fully inside. There is nothing between us, she said steadily. He is pleasant, he is kind, but I feel nothing for him. Lennox rose slowly from the desk. His expression remained guarded. You are free to make whatever decision you wish, he said quietly. That is not the point. Her voice softened. The point is that you have been avoiding me for 6 days. That stopped him. Rosamond held his gaze. I will not pretend not to notice. He turned away slightly, walking toward the window. Snow drifted across the dark gardens outside. For a moment she feared he would say nothing at all. Then he spoke. You deserve a future not complicated by my household. My future was already complicated. He said nothing. Rosamond took a breath and stepped closer. I know what you are doing, she said gently. You are convincing yourself that stepping away is the honorable choice. His shoulders stiffened, but it is not honest. The room fell very still. Finally, Lennox turned back to her. The careful restraint he usually wore had slipped slightly, and behind it, something raw, something dangerously close to truth. For a long moment, the Duke said nothing. The fire crackled softly in the grate. Beyond the windows, the winter wind moved through the dark gardens of Westhaven Park. Rosamond stood where she was, refusing to retreat. I know what you are doing, she repeated quietly. You believe stepping away protects me. Lennox's jaw tightened. And you believe it does not? No. The answer came without hesitation. It protects you. The words struck deeper than she intended. His eyes narrowed slightly. Rosamond drew a slow breath. You are a man who has survived loss by controlling every part of his life, she continued softly. Your estate, your children, your reputation. Silence pressed heavily between them. But this, she said gently, is the one thing you cannot control. The Duke looked at her then, not with the distant politeness he had worn all week, but with the full, unguarded intensity she had first seen the night at the gate. You presume much, Mrs. Vere. Do I? She stepped closer, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion beneath the calm. You built a schoolroom in 3 days. You allowed my sons into your home. You defended me against a man far more socially acceptable than I will ever be. Her voice softened. And you have barely slept for a week because you believe I might leave. The truth hung between them like a drawn blade. For the first time since she had known him, Arden Lennox looked almost shaken. You misunderstand, he said quietly. No. Rosamond met his gaze steadily. I understand perfectly. She paused, then spoke the words she had not planned to say. I refused Lord Aubrey because I love you. The silence that followed felt endless. Lennox did not move, did not breathe. For a terrifying moment she wondered if she had misjudged everything. Then he crossed the room. 2 steps. 3. Stopping directly before her. Rosamond, he said hoarsely. It was the first time he had used her given name. I have tried, he said slowly, for 6 years to remain a man who does not need anyone. His hand closed around hers. Warm, steady. But the night you appeared at my gate in the snow. His voice lowered. That ended. Emotion flickered across his usually controlled face. I built the schoolroom because I wanted you to stay. A breath. And when Crane began courting you, his jaw tightened again. I realized something unacceptable. Rosamond's heart pounded. And what was that? His gray eyes locked onto hers. That I cannot imagine this house without you. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. Rosamond felt warmth spread through her chest. Then you should not try. Another silence followed. This one softer. Lennox studied her face for several seconds. Then he asked quietly, Rosamond Vere, will you marry me? Her answer came with a small, breathless laugh. Yes. The tension left his shoulders in a single visible release. He pulled her into his arms. Not dramatically, not desperately, simply holding her with the steady certainty of a man who had finally stopped resisting something inevitable. The scandal of Lady Winifred Vere ended 2 weeks later. The Duke presented evidence of fraud before the county magistrate. The petition to seize Rosamond's children collapsed instantly. Sir Morton's financial corruption surfaced soon after. Within a month, the Vere family quietly withdrew from Somerset entirely. Society moved on, as society always did. The wedding took place in early spring at the small church on the West Haven estate. It was not a grand affair, only family, only those who mattered. 4 boys sat proudly in the front pew. Frederick whispered loudly to his brother during the vows, "Mama's becoming a duchess." Oliver replied with grave authority, "She was already important." Mrs. Burrell wept discreetly through the entire ceremony. The Duke said his vows with the calm gravity of a man who never spoke lightly, and Rosamond said hers with the quiet certainty of someone who had once sat in the snow with nothing left to lose. 3 months later, Rosamond Lennox, Duchess of Westhaven, entered the Somerset Spring Assembly Hall on her husband's arm. The same society that had once turned its back now bowed respectfully. Curtsies followed her across the room. Rosamond accepted them calmly. She felt no bitterness, only quiet clarity, because she understood something now. Respect offered by fear meant nothing, but respect earned by truth meant everything. Lennox handed her a glass of punch. "How are you?" he asked softly. Rosamond looked around the candlelit hall, at the people who had once ignored her, at the life that had once seemed impossible. Then she looked at the man beside her. "I am exactly where I belong," she said. His fingers closed around hers, and across the crowded ballroom, the Duke of Westhaven smiled.